Let's talk about a particularly interesting, as it is contentious, discussion in monetary economics, and that is the Phillips curve. So if you're interested in the Phillips curve, or if you're in my course and you're required to watch this video, please stay tuned as we discuss the Phillips curve on NyQuil. So far, we've talked mostly about situations in which the classical dichotomy and monetary neutrality held. If you recall, the classical dichotomy states that real and nominal variables can be analyzed separately, and monetary neutrality states that an increase in the money will not have any effect on any real economic variables. But what about when it doesn't hold? Namely, the classical dichotomy and monetary neutrality hold in the long run, but what about the short run? What if, say, in the short run, we have this increase in the money supply? However, in the short run, there is going to be some real economic effect. You will see a reduction in unemployment or an increase in output. And as these real economic effects transmit throughout the economy, you'll see an increase in the rate of inflation, and the real economic effects will eventually subside. In that situation, there's really nothing that goes against monetary neutrality or the classical dichotomy, because we're looking at short to medium term stuff right now instead of the medium to long run stuff. And this is what we're going to be talking about in the lecture today is short run stuff, namely the relationship between inflation and unemployment. In 1958, economist William Phillips got a very interesting statistical finding, which was that there is a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. His 1958 paper found a negative relationship between the two variables. The idea would be that low unemployment is associated with higher inflation, and then vice versa. The notion is that a falling unemployment rate can be indicative of increased labor demand. Firms want people to work for them. If there's a low unemployment rate, that can imply that there are more open positions than there are people to fill those positions. So how do firms compete for quality labor? Well, they increase their wages. They increase the amount that they're willing to pay workers to come and work for them. So you get this upward pressure being put on wages. Now, while firms are willing to pay top dollar for top quality labor, bear in mind they are profit maximizing. So they respond to their increase in labor costs by raising the prices of the goods and services that they provide to the market. So what Phillips did is he tested the relationship between wage inflation and unemployment. And this is more or less what he found. These little blue dots here are each observations. It is some pair of unemployment and inflation. And this blue curve is the estimated Phillips curve. This is the estimated relationship between inflation and unemployment. Now, I would like to say that this is purely a statistical finding. All Phillips really found was just raw correlation. These two things were correlated. These two variables were correlated. And the original form that he estimated was not too unlike what we have right here, that inflation is a function of deviations of the unemployment rate from this natural rate of unemployment. And if you're wondering what the natural rate of unemployment is, it is simply the rate of unemployment that we would have absent any sort of exogenous shocks, anything that is affecting the economy that isn't directly related to unemployment. Because this finding was purely statistical, economic theory had to be developed to try to explain the finding, because what Phillips essentially provided to the world was evidence without a whole lot of theory to back it up. And evidence without theory is trash. Just like theory without evidence is similarly trash. You need theory and you need evidence in order to have a good idea be taken seriously by the academic community. Now, he found evidence which garnered interest in the academic community. It made people go, hey, what? This is kind of interesting. Let's look at this. Let's learn, let's see what's going on, see if we can try to develop some theory. Now, one form of that would be something like this, that we have inflation as our dependent variable. We have U as the rate of unemployment, U sub n as the natural rate of unemployment, inflation. We have expected inflation. We have this term beta, which explains the relationship between inflation and unemployment. And we have this epsilon, which is a zero mean serially uncorrelated residual. Now, in the interest of completeness and correctness, I included that term epsilon. However, we're not really going to be worried about it. So don't worry about if you see an epsilon hanging around throughout this lecture. Don't worry about it. Just sort of assume it's zero, and we can go on from there. Now, there are other forms that are perhaps a bit more intuitive than what we see here. Because if unemployment is really giving us an idea about the health of labor markets, it's telling us about employment, is it not? And employment is labor, and labor is an input for a production function, and production is increasing in labor. Therefore, if labor and inflation are correlated, it would also make sense to assume that output and inflation would be correlated. But if you have something that is being graphed in output and inflation space, what do we call that? We call that the aggregate supply curve. And here we have the rate of output being a function of the natural rate of output, which same kind of idea as the natural rate of unemployment. It's what output would be absent any sort of exogenous shocks. We have inflation. We have expected inflation. We have this term alpha, which explains the sensitivity of output to inflation. And we have our residual, which of course we just assume is zero here. And the idea is that if employment or labor is an input to production, then inflation will affect unemployment, which will affect output. So here are the two different ways that we can look at the Phillips curve. One is the Phillips curve in wage inflation unemployment space, and the other is the Phillips curve in inflation and output space. It is downward sloping in inflation unemployment space, and it is thus upward sloping in inflation and output space. So we have kind of a basic idea behind the Phillips curve, and it's that high inflation implies low unemployment or high output. And a lot of policymakers really liked this idea. I mean, who wouldn't? If you think about it from terms of in terms of a policymaking standpoint, it is an incredibly wonderful thing that can be exploited to help your political career. If you want to look like you're taking care of your constituents, what is a good thing you can do? Well, you can make sure they're all employed. And if you can play around with the money supply, well, okay, cool. You get everybody employed, at least for a little while. Because if there's low unemployment, why not increase inflation a little bit more and reduce unemployment a little bit more? If we have low unemployment, maybe we could tolerate just a little bit of inflation. And honestly, if you had to pick between low prices and not having a job, or having a job and facing slightly higher prices, which one would you rather? I can tell you personally, I would much rather to be employed and face slightly higher prices. In fact, I have been in both of these situations in the past 2.5 years, and I can definitely assure you I would rather the second one. Now, if I really had to pick, I would assume to be employed and have low prices. That would be the best thing ever. But if I had to pick between these two, naturally I would pick being employed and facing higher prices. And the idea of the Phillips curve reigned supreme for a few decades, really until the 1970s. This relationship between inflation and unemployment was, we could say, exploited in the best way that policymakers could actually attempt to do so. And we had high inflation really throughout the 1970s, and we hit what's known as stagflation, where there's high unemployment and high inflation. And that kind of killed the Phillips curve. Now, there were other things that led to stagflation besides just extremely loose monetary policy. However, the loose monetary policy didn't help. And then what was the final nail in the coffin was when we adopted inflation targeting regimes. If we want to look at inflation and unemployment in the United States between 1960 and 1969, this is what we have. We have what appears to be a really nice, like, downward sloping relationship between inflation and unemployment. Hey, that's kind of cool. Looks nice for us, right? Yeah, totally. But let's fast forward a couple of decades. Let's look at like 1969 to, say, 2022. Well, all of a sudden, it just turns into like a shotgun blast. It's just all over the place. This is what we would refer to as a flattening of the Phillips curve. There's really no observable relationship here between inflation and unemployment. Now, if I wanted to look at inflation and unemployment from 1960 to 2022, okay, cool. Blue dots are from 1960 to 69. Red dots are from 69 to 2022. We can see that after the 1960s, things just kind of went all over the place. And there was no discernible relationship between inflation and unemployment. So the Phillips curve died in the 1970s. But leave it to economists to take something that's dead and go, how can we revive it? How can we beat a dead horse back to life? And they took the Phillips curve and they made improvements on it to try to make it a little bit better. Because it was pretty simplistic to assume that there was always this predictable relationship between inflation and unemployment. So could we maybe include like expectations into the model? You saw expectations in the previous specifications. However, it was a backward-looking model. Let's make it forward-looking. We take our expectations augmented Phillips curve and we make it forward-looking. What we're doing is we are adopting this assumption of rational expectations, where we're not looking backward to formulate expectations anymore. We're using all available information today, which does include historical data, but we're also using data that's available today to develop our expectations for the future. And that's what makes it forward-looking. We can also consider maybe the effects that sticky prices would have on an inflation adjustment process. We can take a new Keynesian argument where prices are sticky and may need time to adjust in response to demand-side shocks. If there is a demand shock, firms can either increase prices or increase output. If you can't raise prices, the only thing you can raise is output. So if we have sticky prices, you will have a little bit of an increase in output, at least in the short run. Now, there are many different interpretations for why there's a short-run relationship. There's the signal extraction problem, where firms produce based on expected inflation, and if there's a deviation of actual from expected inflation, it's going to trick firms into producing more stuff. So this function right here would be indicative of a signal extraction problem. There's the sticky price argument. So it's what's known as Calvo pricing, where prices are sticky in the short run, and not all firms can change prices in response to a shock. Some firms have to produce more to satisfy demand rather than just raise prices. And the new Keynesian Phillips curve is given by this, where we have inflation being a function of expected inflation, and this deviation of actual output from a flexible price output, or like potential GDP, so to speak. And this term kappa here is really what is governing the price stickiness. Now, the one that I prefer is the new Keynesian Phillips curve because it provides a very convincing and academically rigorous description of how prices may be slow to adjust in the short run and how that can have an effect on output in the short run. And price stickiness also kind of lines up with the data in terms of inflation and adjustment to shocks. So in terms of short run stuff, there are different ways to sort of think of the Phillips curve, but when we come to comparing short and long run stuff, there are also different ways, right? In the short run, there is a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. Whether it's a signal extraction problem or sticky prices, we have observed real economic responses to monetary policy shocks, which implies that there is some existence of the Phillips curve today. Now, it may not be as tight of a fit as what was originally assumed, and it may not even be as good a fit as what was estimated, 65 years ago now, but it is still a pretty decent relationship. There is still something that can be extracted from this. However, in the long run, there is no trade-off between unemployment and inflation. And this is consistent with monetary neutrality and the classical dichotomy. Because in the long run, the situation we have, if we go with, say, the new Keynesian Phillips curve, is that there's a fraction of firms that can't adjust their prices immediately in response to a demand shock. It becomes costly for prices to raise, or it becomes costly for firms to raise prices. We can think of like the infamous $5 footlong at Subway, right? It's kind of a PR disaster if you've been advertising a $5 footlong at Subway for 5 years, and then all of a sudden you turn it into a $7 or $8 footlong. Now, you can think of a few other examples, and it's not always from a PR standpoint. It could also be something that makes it costly to print a new price on paper or have to go online and update the new price, something like that. So if you can't raise prices to deal with this, you have to produce more. And in the short run, you have a lot of firms that have to make more stuff, but in the medium to long run, more firms can update their prices, and eventually everybody's updated their prices. All prices get updated, and output returns to its potential. Unemployment returns to where it was before the shock. Okay. So what we see here is if we look at the Phillips curve in terms of inflation and output space, this upward sloping relationship that we have is what's describing the short run dynamics. The long run dynamics, on the other hand, is vertical. Why is it vertical? Well, what this is saying is that for just this particular rate of output, you can have any rate of inflation, because in the long run, output is unaffected by inflation. The classical dichotomy, recall, real and nominal variables can be analyzed separately. The real variable here is output, and the nominal variable is inflation. So in the long run, when all prices get updated, you end up with a level or a rate of output that is the same regardless of the rate of inflation, which gives us monetary neutrality in the long run. And it lets us revert to the classical dichotomy for analysis, makes things nice and easy on us. So let's talk about the Federal Reserve and their dual mandate and how this relates to the Phillips curve. The Federal Reserve has a dual mandate, which is 1, to promote stable prices, and 2, to promote maximum employment or to minimize unemployment. Well, that sounds a bit like the Phillips curve, doesn't it? So what's going on? I thought the Phillips curve was garbage and that it was dead. Well, in its original form, it is dead. However, because there is no predictable trade-off between inflation and unemployment, right? You can't go, well, okay, if I want to hit an inflation rate of 5%, I'm going to get an inflation rate or an unemployment rate of X% every time. It doesn't really work that way. But in the augmented form, where we consider inflation expectations, assume a forward-looking framework, it can give us some kind of a relationship. It just may not be as tight of a relationship as we once thought, because there have been changes, right? The monetary policy regimes have changed substantially. We are now in a regime where we have inflation targeting. We are also in a regime where the Federal Open Market Committee will come out and announce their intended federal funds rate targets. These aren't things that were always done by central banks. They weren't things that were always done by the Federal Reserve. Now, we can describe the dual mandate as this right here, what we see in equation 1. Now, we've seen this before, right? They want to minimize unemployment, and they can use inflation to affect unemployment. The idea would be they want to use their announcements, right, after the Federal Open Market Committee get together and they vote on what to do about interest rates. The Federal Open Market Committee chair comes out and gives a nice televised announcement where he discusses, or she, their plans to set interest rates within a certain range, and then they're going to be using open market operations to try to reach that range for the interest rates. the idea would be to guide expected inflation. And they want to use monetary policy to try to set interest rates, which then implies actual inflation. So they achieve some rate of unemployment consistent with the relationship that we see in equation 1, which leads us to something that's really interesting. That it's not the inflation rate that matters for unemployment, but rather surprises to the inflation rate or deviations of actual inflation from expected inflation. Is that something that we've heard about before? I'd like to think so, where we were discussing about expected inflation and how there were deviations. What we can see here is that when it comes to the Phillips curve, based on this equation given here, right, which it's not like the Federal Reserve follows this as their dual mandate. It's not like they're going, oh, okay, well, we have to use this equation right here. This is just an equation that would describe the behavior in a way. It's a model, and recall that all models are wrong, but some models are useful. One could make the argument that this model is particularly useful. So if we go by this model, it's not inflation itself that matters, but inflation surprises. So if the Federal Reserve is tasked with minimizing unemployment and promoting stable prices, right, making sure inflation and expected inflation aren't too different from each other, if we listen to the greatest economist ever, Milton Friedman, the economy gets used to any inflation rate that you set. You could theoretically have an economy with an inflation rate of 10%, because everybody knows that prices will be increasing by 10% per year. And maybe instead of interest rates at 3%, they could be 13%. So if you get used to any inflation rate that you set, it's not inflation itself that matters. It's surprise inflation. It's the trickery. And also the amount that these surprises will be affecting unemployment rate by this coefficient alpha. It isn't inflation that produces the stimulus. It's higher than expected inflation that produces stimulus. So let's do a couple of examples. Let's assume the natural rate of unemployment is equal to 3%. Alpha is equal to 3 over 2, or 1.5. Inflation is 2%, and expected inflation is 2%. We'll be assuming epsilon is 0 throughout this entire lecture. So what's going on? What can I gather from these figures under my assumptions? Well, the natural rate of unemployment is 3%. Inflation is equal to expected inflation at 2%. And because expected and actual inflation are equal, the economy is used to an inflation rate of 2%. So from this, if I want to plug everything in to figure out what the unemployment rate would be, I just do the natural rate, which is 3, minus alpha times inflation minus expected inflation, which is 3 over 2 times 2 minus 2. I get 3 minus 3 over 2 times 0, which is just 3%. So the unemployment rate here is 3%. And the economy is used to an inflation rate of 2% here. But what if, say, we're used to an inflation rate of 2% and expected inflation, what if inflation and expected inflation were equal to 10%? Well, we could plug everything in to find the unemployment rate. And if inflation and expected inflation are equal to each other at 10%, well, unemployment is still equal to the natural rate, which is 3%. So regardless of the rate of inflation, unemployment will still be the same so long as inflation and expected inflation are equal to each other, which is kind of an interesting proposition if you think about it. But what if expected inflation is 2% and the central bank wants to lower unemployment by raising inflation from, say, 2 to 5%? Well, we're going to be keeping everything the same as what we had in the previous example. We're just going to let pi t change. I set pi t equal to 5 rather than, was it 3 or 2? I think it was 2. So I do u equals 3 minus 3 over 2 times 5 minus 2, which is 3. So I get 3 minus 9 over 2, which gives me 2.5%. The unemployment rate is down to 2.5% because inflation today was above expectations. And the public set future inflation equal to expected future inflation to today's inflation. So for tomorrow, the public set expected inflation equal to what inflation was today. And the economy is now used to a new inflation rate of 5%. So let's see what happens on the next slide. So the public's used to inflation at 5% now. And let's say the central bank doesn't want to impact unemployment in the next period. So actual inflation is set to expected inflation, meaning unemployment in the next period is 3%. So we have unemployment of 3% and inflation at 5%. If the central bank wants to reduce unemployment tomorrow below 3%, they have to increase inflation to be above 5%. So suppose the central bank wants to increase inflation in period T plus 2 to lower unemployment again. Well, expected inflation in T plus 2 is 5, and we need a higher inflation rate than 5% to be able to actually produce lower inflation. So let's say I set inflation equal to 7%. Plug that into the Phillips curve, and what I get is an unemployment rate of 0%. I have 100% full employment, but I'm getting that at a price of inflation at 7%. And we may have a little bit of a problem here with unemployment because it is not going to be costless to stop high inflation. Now we could be perfectly used to 7% inflation. However, tomorrow we will have 7% inflation and 3% unemployment. If we want to get inflation down, because remember, there are costs to inflation, right? It's not like, everything is totally fine if we have high inflation. So let's say we want to try to get inflation down. If we want to do that, it is not costless to stop high inflation. So what if the central bank wants to reduce inflation? Well, expected inflation in period 3, or T plus 3, is going to be 7%. Now, they could reduce inflation back to 2%, so let's plug that in. Well, I get 3 minus 3 over 2 times 2 minus 7. I get 3 minus 3 over 2 times negative 5, which means I'm getting 3 plus 15 over 2, or 3 plus 7.5, 10.5%. Unemployment will be 10.5% if you try to drastically reduce inflation. So the key takeaway here is that if the central bank wants to lower inflation, they have to tolerate high unemployment, which could be bad for the central bank because they don't want an unhappy public. Now, fortunately for us, the Federal Reserve is independent. An unhappy public doesn't mean that everybody at the Fed is fired, because the Federal Reserve chairs aren't elected by the populace, but it will violate their dual mandate, which isn't good. Namely, they're going to have to go and answer questions to Congress that they may not want to have to answer. So if the Federal Reserve has this dual mandate, it means they have to control both output and inflation. But we got a problem here. The lowest possible inflation rate isn't the 2% target that the Fed mentions. It's actually 0. But the task is to minimize unemployment, which means they have to be willing to tolerate a slightly higher inflation rate if they want to try to have some kind of real effect on unemployment. And we're going to learn a great detail about this later on when it comes to central bank credibility and rules versus discretion. But sometimes the Fed may try to make things better and make things worse as a result. So should the Fed have discretion to set inflation to lower unemployment? Or should there be some kind of a rule that forces them to just minimize inflation and not be concerned with unemployment at all? Well, all of that is a topic that we will be discussing in some future videos, but it is something that's worth thinking about. Should the central bank be required to maintain some sort of a credible plan when it comes to inflation? Should they be required to stick to some inflation minimizing rule and not be concerned about unemployment? Namely, should the Federal Reserve only be focused on inflation, or should they be focused on inflation and trying to alter or affect the real economy? So let's wrap up here. We learned a little bit about the Phillips curve. We learned about the short run relationship between inflation and unemployment. We learned about where it needed improvement and what some of these improvements were. And we learned about the concept of rules versus discretion. Now, like I've said before, there's a lot of fun that we're going to have with rules versus discretion. And we're going to learn all about it. Actually, it's like the last thing we do in this class. And we're going to get Milton Friedman's opinion on it as well. Now, you're probably like, I am so sick of hearing we're going to do this stuff later. Trust me, it's going to come later. And this is me kind of teasing some really fun, interesting material that we're going to get, where we actually get into some game theory and we learn about like Nash equilibria, all that fun stuff in monetary policy. Now, next, we're going to be talking about money growth and inflation. And again, we're going to hear the thoughts of Milton Friedman a little bit more as well. So stay tuned for the money growth and inflation lecture, because that is another one that is endlessly fascinating. Thank you for watching.